I'm David Preston, and you're listening to the Lit AF podcast. Join us each week for a tour through the literary classics like you have never heard them before. Each season is a new book, and each episode is a new way of thinking about it. If you'd like more information about becoming a sponsor or a member of the Lit AF community, which will enable you to attend live streams with authors, get discounts on merchandise, participate in community forums, and even determine what I read next, come find us on the web at litafpodcast.com. Hi, and welcome back to the Lit AF podcast. This week we're reading Chapter 8 of The Great Gatsby. This is the second to last chapter of the book, and I don't know, I guess it's like the semifinals of a tournament. But more than that, the word penultimate comes to mind. This is our second to last bite of the apple that F. Scott Fitzgerald is offering us to think about love and the ways that people entangle themselves in relationships because of our desperate need to experience affection. It's affection from ourselves toward other people. It's affection and the approval of the other people we desire. And it's even affection toward ourselves as a result of feeling that we're worth it. And this is timeless. You know, I've often commented as we've gone along about how F. Scott Fitzgerald doesn't really do a lot on the pages of The Great Gatsby to locate this book in time. There are a few references. There's a reference to the Black Sox scandal, to prohibition. But really, these characters and these events and these feelings could happen. Actually, they have happened in every era, and they'll continue to happen. They remind me of the words of Marcus Aurelius, who wrote, quote, "Bear in mind that all of this has happened before and will happen again. The same plot from beginning to end, the identical staging. Produce them in your mind as you know them from experience or from history. The court of Hadrian, of Antonius, the court of Philip, Alexander, Croesus, all just the same, only the people different." End quote. And as I think about just the ways in my life that I've seen friends and relatives and loved ones and my own self handle romantic attraction. Handle is a way too intentional choice of words. Experience would be better. Get knocked over by, maybe. It strikes me how individual and unique we all think we are. And yet, how those feelings of individuality and uniqueness actually connect us together in ways it takes a novel to reveal. Now, one of the things that happens over and over again throughout human and geological time are the seasons of the earth. And F. Scott Fitzgerald does a masterfully subtle job of positioning the plot of The Great Gatsby within the seasons of the year. And on the very first few pages of the book, when we meet our narrator, Nick, he says, quote, "Father agreed to finance me for a year, and after various delays, I came east, permanently, I thought, in the spring of 22. So the entire plot of The Great Gatsby takes us from spring through the summer, and now in Chapter 8 we're entering fall, which I'll get to in a second. But let's start by thinking about spring. This podcast episode is coming out in the spring, the week after Easter and the beginning of Passover, as it happens, during Passover. And spring is the season of renewal in nature. It's the season of rebirth. It's the season of thawing out from winter and coming back to life, of new life. And so whether you're part of the Judeo-Christian tradition and you identify with stories of Passover or Easter, or whether you identify with nature and you are a person who knows that the story of Easter is actually rooted in stories that are older chronologically. Maybe you know the Sumerian legend of Damuzi or Tammuz and his wife Inanna or Ishtar. The epic myth, the descent of Inanna, was found inscribed on cuneiform clay tablets that date back to something like 2100 BC. And stories of love interests following each other into the underworld is as old as humanity. And the idea that we can reinvent ourselves is equally deep within us, within all of us. Sometimes it's a hope, sometimes it's a belief, sometimes it's a fantasy that's not even grounded in reality. But as we begin chapter 8, let's take a quick moment to reflect. Mrs. Wilson is dead. Mr. Wilson is beside himself, insane with grief. Tom is close behind. And if the love affair between Gatsby and Daisy isn't yet dead, it's definitely on life support, because Daisy, at the end of chapter 7, has returned to the protection of Tom just for the basic security, because right now, between a guilty conscience and the fact that she has actually murdered someone with a vehicle, we got problems. Chapter 8. I couldn't sleep all night. A foghorn was groaning incessantly on the sound, and I tossed half sick between grotesque reality and savage, frightening dreams. Savage, frightening dreams. Toward dawn, I heard a taxi go up Gatsby's drive, and immediately I jumped out of bed and began to dress. I felt that I had something to tell him, something to warn him about, and morning would be too late. Crossing his lawn, I saw that his front door was still open, and he was leaning against a table in the hall, heavy with dejection or sleep. Nothing happened, he said wanly. Now remember, we ended chapter 7 with Gatsby holding vigil outside Daisy's house, even though she showed no evidence of wanting him there. Gatsby, in his own mind, was protecting Daisy from what might happen with Tom. Gatsby again. I waited, and about 4 o'clock she came to the window and stood there for a minute, and then turned out the light. His house had never seemed so enormous to me as it did that night when we hunted through the great rooms for cigarettes. We pushed aside curtains that were like pavilions and felt over innumerable feet of dark wall for electric light switches. Once I tumbled with a sort of splash upon the keys of a ghostly piano. Ghostly piano. Now, fall, as opposed to spring, is the season in nature when things die. And this is the first reference to the changing of the season, not only in nature as a backdrop and a setting, but also in the tone, the spirit, and the characters of this book. There was an inexplicable amount of dust everywhere, and the rooms were musty as though they hadn't been aired for many days. I found the humidor on an unfamiliar table with 2 stale, dry cigarettes inside. Throwing open the French windows of the drawing room, we sat smoking out into the darkness. You ought to go away, I said. It's pretty certain they'll trace your car. Go away now, old sport? Go to Atlantic City for a week, or up to Montreal. He wouldn't consider it. He couldn't possibly leave Daisy until he knew what she was going to do. He was clutching at some last hope, and I couldn't bear to shake him free. It was this night that he told me the strange story of his youth with Dan Cody. Told it to me because, quote, J. Gatsby, end quote, had broken up like glass against Tom's hard malice, and the long, secret extravaganza was played out. It almost seems that as much of a dick as Tom is, I'm going to change this because dickness doesn't sound as good to me as assholery. So as much of an asshole as Tom is, Tom's assholery is somehow emblematic of an integrity to Fitzgerald as he writes this. And the fact that it has integrity behind the veneer means that since Gatsby's reinvented himself as something that he really wasn't to begin with, when he runs up to what Tom really was to begin with, it's Gatsby that gives way. I think that he would have not acknowledged anything now without reserve, but he wanted to talk about Daisy. She was the first nice girl he had ever known. In various unrevealed capacities, he had come in contact with such people, but always with indiscernible barbed wire between. He found her excitingly desirable. He went to her house, at first with other officers from Camp Taylor, then alone. It amazed him. He had never been in such a beautiful house before. But what gave it an air of breathless intensity was that Daisy lived there. It was as casual a thing to her as his tent out at camp was to him. There was a ripe mystery about it, a hint of bedrooms upstairs, more beautiful and cool than other bedrooms, of gay and radiant activities taking place through its corridors, and of romances that were not musty and laid away already in lavender, but fresh and breathing, and redolent of this year's shining motor cars and of dances whose flowers were scarcely withered. It excited him, too, that many men had already loved Daisy. It increased her value in his eyes. He felt their presence all about the house, pervading the air with the shades and echoes of still vibrant emotions. But he knew that he was in Daisy's house by a colossal accident. However glorious might be his future as Jay Gatsby, he was, at present, a penniless young man without a past, and at any moment the invisible cloak of his uniform might slip from his shoulders. So, he made the most of his time. He took what he could get, ravenously and unscrupulously. Eventually, he took Daisy one still October night, took her because he had no real right to touch her hand. He might have despised himself, for he had certainly taken her under false pretenses. I don't mean that he had traded on his phantom millions, but he had deliberately given Daisy a sense of security. He let her believe that he was a person from much the same strata as herself, that he was fully able to take care of her. As a matter of fact, he had no such facilities. He had no comfortable family standing behind him, and he was liable at the whim of an impersonal government to be blown anywhere about the world. But he didn't despise himself, and it didn't turn out as he had imagined. He had intended, probably, to take what he could and go. But now he found that he had committed himself to the following of a grail. He knew that Daisy was extraordinary, but he didn't realize just how extraordinary a nice girl could be. She vanished into her rich house, into her rich, full life, leaving Gatsby nothing. He felt married to her. That was all. When they met again 2 days later, it was Gatsby who was breathless, who was somehow betrayed. Her porch was bright with the bought luxury of starshine. The wicker of the settee squeaked fashionably as she turned toward him, and he kissed her curious and lovely mouth. She had caught a cold, and it made her voice huskier and more charming than ever, and Gatsby was overwhelmingly aware of the youth and mystery that wealth imprisons and preserves, of the freshness of many clothes, and of Daisy, gleaming like silver, safe and proud above the hot struggles of the poor. I'm going to take a pause because I've thought about this a lot in my life. I've been fortunate to know people of many different walks of life, many different levels of economic success and hardship. And it always strikes me that there seems like this inverse correlation between success and sanity, success and resilience, success and wholeness, or whatever I might think of as emotional well-being or contentment. And what I mean by that is that the people I've met who have a lot of money, especially people I've met who have a lot of money and wear it on the outside where everybody else can see it ostentatiously and share it with their children who haven't yet done anything to earn it. It seems like these people somehow simultaneously manage to get both soft and bitter at the same time in ways I'll never understand because I didn't grow up like that. And it's not that I envy them. It's not that I hold it against them or resent them for it. It's just that, I don't know, in a way I kind of root for them. You know, if somebody's going to have that much money, I want them to be happy. I want them to feel contentment because like most Americans, I grew up with a story that says if you are rich, then somehow you have succeeded, and therefore you will be happy and content. And then I contrast all of that with some of the poorest people I've met financially. I work with students on a regular basis whose families are, picking strawberries in the fields, or homeless, or displaced from their countries. I remember being in Bali once and learning not only how few economic resources most of the families I met had, but also that when they got anything they didn't need, they threw a party because they valued connection over material wealth. And they were happy. Not only were they happy, but they were smiling all the time. And part of their smiles were like their canines were filed down because they didn't want any sharp edges. They wanted to show that they were gentle and friendly and loving. And I got distracted in that moment as I was reading, because in thinking about Daisy and Tom and thinking about some of the people I know with a lot of money who still have enough bile to treat the people around them unkindly, I just don't understand. And I don't think I want to. I just think I want it to be different. And the stoic in me says, yeah, well, good luck with that. So I'll continue to be right with the world, and I'll align my own reasonable choice about how to be with that. It just doesn't make a lot of sense to me. Back to the text. I can't describe to you how surprised I was to find out I loved her, old sport. I even hoped for a while that she'd throw me over, but she didn't, because she was in love with me too. She thought I knew a lot because I knew different things from her. Well, there I was, way off my ambitions, getting deeper in love every minute, and all of a sudden, I didn't care. What was the use of doing great things if I could have a better time telling her what I was going to do? On the last afternoon before he went abroad, he sat with Daisy in his arms for a long, silent time. It was a cold fall day, here received Fitzgerald, alluding to the seasons, with fire in the room and her cheeks flushed. Now and then she moved, and he changed his arm a little, and once he kissed her dark shining hair. The afternoon had made them tranquil for a while, as if to give them a deep memory for the long parting the next day promised. They had never been closer in their month of love, nor communicated more profoundly with one another than when she brushed silent lips against his coat's shoulder, or when he touched the end of her fingers gently as though she were asleep. He did extraordinarily well in the war. He was a captain before he went to the front, and following the Argonne battles, he got his majority and the command of the divisional machine guns. After the armistice, he tried frantically to get home, but some complication or misunderstanding sent him to Oxford instead. He was worried now. There was a quality of nervous despair in Daisy's letters. She didn't see why he couldn't come. She was feeling the pressure of the world outside, and she wanted to see him and feel his presence beside her and be reassured that she was doing the right thing after all. For Daisy was young, and her artificial world was redolent of orchids and pleasant, cheerful snobbery and orchestras, which set the rhythm of the year, summing up the sadness and suggestiveness of life in new tunes. All night, the saxophones wailed the hopeless comment of the Beale Street Blues, while 100 pairs of golden and silver slippers shuffled the shining dust. At the gray tea hour, there were always rooms that throbbed incessantly with this low, sweet fever, while fresh faces drifted here and there like rose petals blown by the sad horns around the floor. Through this twilight universe, Daisy began to move again with the seasons. Suddenly she was again keeping 6 dates a day with 6 men, and drowsing asleep at dawn with the beads and chiffon of an evening dress tangled among dying orchids on the floor beside her bed. And all the time, something within her was crying for a decision. She wanted her life shaped now, immediately, and the decision must be made by some force of love, of money, of unquestionable practicality that was close at hand. That force took shape in the middle of the spring with the arrival of Tom Buchanan. There was a wholesome bulkiness about his person and his position, and Daisy was flattered. Doubtless there was a certain struggle and a certain relief. The letter reached Gatsby while he was still at Oxford. It was dawn now on Long Island, and we went. I can't help but notice Tom, for that matter, Gatsby, they're not actual three-dimensional people, it seems, to Daisy. They're characters in a story that she herself has authored. And you see this a lot in relationships, right? And obviously it's important to know ourselves well enough to know what needs we have and how other people and their presence in our lives might meet those needs. Well, let's see where this takes us. It was dawn now on Long Island, and we went about opening the rest of the windows downstairs, filling the house with gray turning, gold turning light. The shadow of a tree fell abruptly across the dew, and ghostly birds began to sing among the blue leaves. There was a slow, pleasant movement in the air, scarcely a wind, promising a cool, lovely day. I don't think she ever loved him. Gatsby turned around from a window and looked at me challengingly. You must remember, old sport, she was very excited this afternoon. He told her those things in a way that frightened her, that made it look as if I was some kind of cheap sharper. And the result was she hardly knew what she was saying. Now, obviously, Gatsby's talking about the conversation at the hotel in the last chapter where Gatsby confronted Daisy and Tom. And Daisy at first said that she did love Gatsby and that she did not love Tom, but quickly got, well, whatever she got, she changed her story and then said, no, actually I had loved Tom and I'm not really sure of myself. And then it sort of disintegrated from there. Gatsby sat down gloomily. Of course she might have loved him, just for a minute, when they were first married, and loved me more even then, do you see? Suddenly he came out with a curious remark. In any case, he said, it was just personal. This is one of those moments where Fitzgerald uses cognitive dissonance to great effect. Cognitive dissonance is when you put two ideas together that don't follow from one another, that seem to contradict each other, and create a hiccup or a moment of confusion in the mind of the reader or the listener that we then have an urge to resolve. Just personal. Well, personal seems awfully important. In fact, I'm thinking about Godfather 2 when Michael Corleone says to Sonny, it's not personal, it's just business. But here it's just personal. What could you make of that except to suspect some intensity in his conception of the affair that couldn't be measured? He came back from France when Tom and Daisy were still on their wedding trip and made a miserable but irresistible journey to Louisville on the last day of his army pay. He stayed there a week, walking the streets where their footsteps had clicked together through the November night and revisiting the out-of-the-way places to which they had driven in her white car. Just as Daisy's house had always seemed to him more mysterious and gay than other houses, so his idea of the city itself, even though she was gone from it, was pervaded with a melancholy beauty. He left feeling that if he had searched harder, he might have found her, that he was leaving her behind. The day coach, he was penniless now, was hot. He went out to the open vestibule and sat down on a folding chair, and the station slid away and the backs of unfamiliar buildings moved by. Then out into the spring fields, where a yellow trolley raced them for a minute with people in it who might once have seen the pale magic of her face along the casual street. The track curved, and now it was going away from the sun, which, as it sank lower, seemed to spread itself in benediction over the vanishing city where she had drawn her breath. He stretched out his hand desperately, as if to snatch only a wisp of air, to save a fragment of the spot that she had made lovely for him. But it was all going by too fast for his blurred eyes, and he knew now that he had lost that part of it, the freshest and the best, forever. It was 9 o'clock when we finished breakfast and went out on the porch. The night had made a sharp difference in the weather, and there was an autumn flavor in the air. The gardener, the last one of Gatsby's former servants, came to the foot of the steps. I'm going to drain the pool today, Mr. Gatsby. Leaves will start falling pretty soon, and then there's always trouble with the pipes. Don't do it today, Gatsby answered. He turned to me apologetically. You know, old sport, I've never used that pool all summer. I looked at my watch and stood up. 12 minutes to my train. I didn't want to go to the city. I wasn't worth a decent stroke of work, but it was more than that. I didn't want to leave Gatsby. I missed that train, and then another, before I could get myself away. I'll call you up, I said finally. Do, old sport. I'll call you about noon. We walked slowly down the steps. I suppose Daisy'll call too. He looked at me anxiously as if he'd hoped I'd corroborate this. I suppose so. Well, goodbye. We shook hands and I started away. Just before I reached the hedge, I remembered something and turned around. They're a rotten crowd, I shouted across the lawn. You're worth the whole damn bunch put together. I've always been glad I said that. It was the only compliment I ever gave him, because I disapproved of him from beginning to end. First, he nodded politely, and then his face broke into that radiant and understanding smile, as if we'd been in ecstatic cahoots on that fact all the time. His gorgeous pink rag of a suit made a bright spot of color against the white steps, and I thought of the night when I first came to his ancestral home 3 months before. The lawn and drive had been crowded with the faces of those who guessed at his corruption, and he had stood on those steps, concealing his incorruptible dream, as he waved them goodbye. I thanked him for his hospitality. We were always thanking him for that, I and the others. Goodbye, I called. I enjoyed breakfast, Gatsby. Up in the city, I tried for a while to list the quotations on an interminable amount of stock. Then I fell asleep in my swivel chair. Just before noon, the phone woke me, and I started up with sweat breaking out on my forehead. It was Jordan Baker. She often called me up at this hour because the uncertainty of her own movements between hotels and clubs and private houses made her hard to find in any other way. Usually, her voice came over the wire as something fresh and cool, as if a divot from a green golf links had come sailing in at the office window. But this morning it seemed harsh and dry. I've left Daisy's house, she said. I'm at Hempstead, and I'm probably going down to Southampton this afternoon. Probably it had been tactful to leave Daisy's house, but the act annoyed me, and her next remark made me rigid. You weren't so nice to me last night. How could it have mattered then? Silence for a moment. Then, however, I want to see you. I want to see you too. Suppose I don't go to Southampton and come into town this afternoon. No, I don't think this afternoon. Very well. It's impossible this afternoon. We talked like that for a while, and then abruptly we weren't talking any longer. I don't know which one of us hung up with a sharp click, but I didn't care. I couldn't have talked to her across a tea table that day, if I never talked to her again in this world. I called Gatsby's house a few minutes later, but the line was busy. I tried 4 times. Finally, an exasperated central told me the wire was being kept open for long distance from Detroit. Taking out my timetable, I drew a small circle around the 3:50 train. Then I leaned back in my chair and tried to think. It was just noon. When I passed the ash heaps on the train that morning, I had crossed deliberately to the other side of the car. I supposed there'd be a curious crowd around there all day with little boys searching for dark spots in the dust, and some garrulous man telling over and over what had happened until it became less and less real, even to him, and he could tell it no longer, and Myrtle Wilson's tragic achievement was forgotten. Now I want to go back a little and tell what happened at the garage after we left there the night before. They had difficulty in locating the sister, Catherine. She must have broken her rule against drinking that night, for when she arrived she was stupid with liquor and unable to understand that the ambulance had already gone to Flushing. When they convinced her of this, she immediately fainted as if that was the intolerable part of the affair. Someone kind or curious took her in his car and drove her in the wake of her sister's body. Until long after midnight, a changing crowd lapped up against the front of the garage, while George Wilson rocked himself back and forth on the couch inside. I think about these images. When Fitzgerald writes lapped up against the front of the garage, it seems like a tide. And when George Wilson rocks himself back and forth, these are not linear movements with a beginning, middle, or an end. They're just ceaseless motion, cyclical, happening over and over. For a while, the door of the office was open, and everyone who came into the garage glanced irresistibly through it. Finally, someone said it was a shame and closed the door. Michaelis and several other men were with him. First 4 or 5 men, later 2 or 3 men. Still later, Michaelis had to ask the last stranger to wait there 15 minutes longer while he went back to his own place and made a pot of coffee. After that, he stayed there alone with Wilson until dawn. About 3 o'clock, the quality of Wilson's incoherent muttering changed. He grew quieter and began to talk about the yellow car. He announced that he had a way of finding out whom the yellow car belonged to. And then he blurted out that a couple of months ago, his wife had come home from the city with her face bruised and her nose swollen. But when he heard himself say this, he flinched and began to cry, "Oh my God," again in his groaning voice. Michaelis made a clumsy attempt to distract him. "How long have you been married, George? Come on there, try to sit still a minute and answer my question. How long have you been married?" 12 years. Ever had any children? Come on, George, sit still. I asked you a question. Did you ever have any children? The hard brown beetles kept thudding against the dull light, and whenever Michaelis heard a car go tearing along the road outside, it sounded to him like the car that hadn't stopped a few hours before. He didn't like to go into the garage because the workbench was stained where the body had been lying. So he moved uncomfortably around the office. He knew every object in it before morning, and from time to time sat down beside Wilson trying to keep him more quiet. "Have you got a church you go to sometimes, George? Maybe even if you haven't been there for a long time? Maybe I could call up the church and get a priest to come over, and he could talk to you, see? Don't belong to any. You ought to have a church, George, for times like this. You must have gone to church once. Didn't you get married in a church? Listen, George, listen to me. Didn't you get married in a church?" That was a long time ago. The effort of answering broke the rhythm of his rocking. For a moment, he was silent. Then the same half-knowing, half-bewildered look came back into his faded eyes. "Look in the drawer there," he said, pointing at the desk. "Which drawer?" "That drawer. That one." Before we get to the contents of the drawer, I want to talk about the church comment for a second. In open source learning, we talk about spiritual fitness, but it's not really about religion. Michaelis didn't say you should go to church and pray to God, or ask for a reason why, or seek absolution, or deal with your original sin. Nothing in there had anything to do with the actual rules of engagement of Christianity. It didn't matter if he was saying go to a church, go to a mosque, go to a synagogue, go to a spa, go to a gym. The idea is find a sense of community, find a sense of belonging, find a connection to remind yourself that you're not alone. And in that way, the spiritual fitness of open source learning is designed not with religion in mind, certainly not any specific religion in mind, but even if you're standing on the edge of the Grand Canyon or looking up at the night sky or at the beach looking out over the ocean or even a big enough lake where you can't see land on the other edge of the horizon, we're all part of something bigger. And it seems to me that even in this minor moment of fictional character misery, that for all the isolation people have experienced during the pandemic, that is an amplification of the isolation we experience in our day-to-day lives. If you've ever read the book Bowling Alone by Robert Putnam, if you have read David Reisman's The Lonely Crowd, if you have just thought about what it's like to move through your daily life, even if you're involved in social media, sometimes especially if you're involved in social media on the internet, we have a lot of opportunities, but not as much gratification about the relationships we seek beyond our intimate partnerships and romantic entanglements, beyond our families, beyond our immediate circle of longtime friends. And people talk a lot about social safety nets in terms of support during illness or catastrophic events. But these little moments in life, it doesn't have to be as big as losing a loved one, bring into clear relief the need for those kinds of bonds. Back to the drawer. Michaelis opened the drawer nearest his hand. There was nothing in it but a small, expensive dog leash made of leather and braided silver. It was apparently new. "This?" he inquired, holding it up. Wilson stared and nodded. "I found it yesterday afternoon. She tried to tell me about it, but I knew it was something funny." "You mean your wife bought it?" "She had it wrapped in tissue paper on her bureau." Michaelis didn't see anything odd in that, and he gave Wilson a dozen reasons why his wife might have bought the dog leash. But conceivably, Wilson had heard some of these same explanations before from Myrtle, because he began saying, "Oh my God," again in a whisper. His comforter left several explanations in the air. "Then he killed her," said Wilson. His mouth dropped open suddenly. "Who did?" "I have a way of finding out." "You're morbid, George," said his friend. "This has been a strain to you, and you don't know what you're saying. You'd better try and sit quiet till morning." "He murdered her." "It was an accident, George." Wilson shook his head. His eye narrowed, and his mouth widened slightly with the ghost of a superior "I know," he said definitely. "I'm one of those trusting fellas, and I don't think any harm to nobody. But when I get to know a thing, I know it. It was the man in that car. She ran out to speak to him, and he wouldn't stop." Michaelis had seen this too, but it hadn't occurred to him that there was any special significance in it. He believed that Mrs. Wilson had been running away from her husband, rather than trying to stop any particular car. How could she have been like that? "She's a deep one," said Wilson, as if that answered the question. He began to rock again, and Michaelis stood twisting the leash in his hand. "Maybe you got some friend that I could telephone for, George?" This was a forlorn hope. He was almost sure that Wilson had no friend. There was not enough of him for his wife. He was glad a little later when he noticed a change in the room, a blue quickening by the window, and realized that dawn wasn't far off. About 5 o'clock, it was blue enough outside to snap off the light. Wilson's glazed eyes turned out to the ash heaps, where small gray clouds took on fantastic shape and scurried here and there in the faint dawn wind. "I spoke to her," he muttered after a long silence. "I told her she might fool me, but she couldn't fool God. I took her to the window." With an effort, he got up and walked to the rear window and leaned with his face pressed against it. "And I said, God knows what you've been doing, everything you've been doing. You may fool me, but you can't fool God." Standing behind him, Michaelis saw with a shock that he was looking at the eyes of Dr. T.J. Eckelberg, which had just emerged, pale and enormous from the dissolving night. "God sees everything," repeated Wilson. "And here I get a luxury. This is the kind of symbolism that every teacher, every SAT guide, every AP exam, every Spark Note, Cliff Note, crap note you can find talks about these images, and it's too fucking simple. It's not the point. Fitzgerald, it was kind of ham-handed here, if you want my opinion. Putting the spectacles on the wall, talking about the eyes of God. No shit. How much of a fucking rocket scientist do you have to be to figure that one out? What's more important in this scene is the fact that Michaelis is looking for some relief. He wants to call a friend in from the bullpen in the worst way because he's just getting worn out. And Wilson is also running out of options because what do we do when we got nothing left? We turn to fictional stories. And forgive me, if you're a religious person, I love you. I really do, and I mean that. Every world religion has this beautiful wisdom that the people who truly believe espouse in ways that I only aspire to, and I mean every word. But the Lord works in mysterious ways? Fuck off. God sees everything, repeated Wilson. That's an advertisement, Michaelis assured him. Something made him turn away from the window and look back into the room. But Wilson stood there a long time, his face close to the window pane, nodding into the twilight. By 6 o'clock, Michaelis was worn out and grateful for the sound of a car stopping outside. It was one of the watchers of the night before who had promised to come back, so he cooked breakfast for 3, which he and the other man ate together. Wilson was quieter now, and Michaelis went home to sleep. When he awoke 4 hours later and hurried back to the garage, Wilson was gone. His movements, he was on foot all the time, were afterward traced to Port Roosevelt and then to Gad's Hill, where he bought a sandwich that he didn't eat and a cup of coffee. He must have been tired and walking slowly, for he didn't reach Gad's Hill until noon. Thus far, there was no difficulty in accounting for his time. There were boys who had seen a man acting sort of crazy, quote unquote, and motorists at whom he stared oddly from the side of the road. Then, for 3 hours, he disappeared from view. The police, on the strength of what he said to Michaelis, that he had a way of finding out, supposed that he spent that time going from garage to garage thereabouts inquiring for a yellow car. On the other hand, no garage man who had seen him ever came forward, and perhaps he had an easier, surer way of finding out what he wanted to know. By 2:30, he was in West Egg, where he asked someone the way to Gatsby's house, so by that time he knew Gatsby's name. At 2 o'clock, Gatsby put on his bathing suit and left word with the butler that if anyone phoned, word was to be brought to him at the pool. He stopped at the garage for a pneumatic mattress that had amused his guests during the summer, and the chauffeur helped him pump it up. Then he gave instructions that the open car wasn't to be taken out under any circumstances, and this was strange because the right front fender needed repair. Gatsby shouldered the mattress and started for the pool. Once he stopped and shifted it a little, and the chauffeur asked him if he needed help, but he shook his head, and in a moment disappeared among the yellowing trees. I like that little casual reminder of the season. No telephone message arrived, but the butler went without his sleep and waited for it until 4 o'clock, until long after there was anyone to give it to if it came. I have an idea that Gatsby himself didn't believe it would come. In a way, he didn't believe that Daisy would call. And perhaps he no longer cared. If that was true, he must have felt that he had lost the old warm world, paid a high price for living too long with a single dream. He must have looked up at an unfamiliar sky through frightening leaves and shivered as he found what a grotesque thing a rose is, and how raw the sunlight was upon the scarcely created grass. A new world, material without being real, where poor ghosts, breathing dreams like air, drifted fortuitously about, like that ashen, fantastic figure gliding toward him through the amorphous trees. The chauffeur, he was one of Wolfsheim's protégés, heard the shots. Afterwards, he could only say that he hadn't thought anything much about them. I drove from the station directly to Gatsby's house, and my rushing anxiously up the front steps was the first thing that alarmed anyone. But they knew then, I firmly believe. With scarcely a word said, 4 of us, the chauffeur, butler, gardener, and I, hurried down to the pool. There was a faint, barely perceptible movement of the water as the fresh flow from one end urged its way toward the drain at the other. With little ripples that were hardly the shadows of waves, the laden mattress moved irregularly down the pool. A small gust of wind that scarcely corrugated the surface was enough to disturb its accidental course with its accidental burden. The touch of a cluster of leaves revolved it slowly, tracing, like the leg of a compass, a thin red circle in the water. It was after we started with Gatsby toward the house that the gardener saw Wilson's body a little way off in the grass, and the Holocaust was complete. Fall. Season of death. Thanks for listening. Next week, we'll read the last chapter of The Great Gatsby. See you then. In the meantime, if you're interested in sponsoring the podcast or joining the Lit AF community, please head on over to our website at litafpodcast.com. Thanks for listening.